The death of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, confirmed by an Israeli official, has pushed the Middle East into a level of instability unseen in decades. Within hours of the coordinated pre-dawn strike on February 28, carried out by Israel and the United States, Iran launched a sweeping regional retaliation campaign, igniting a new and highly dangerous spiral of confrontation. Tehran deployed dozens of missiles targeting American military installations across Qatar, Jordan, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Kurdish areas in northern Iraq. At the same time, additional waves of missiles and drones struck Israeli territory, signaling that this was not an emotional reaction, but a calibrated strategic counterstrike. Notably absent from the target list was Oman. The reason lies in Muscat's quiet role as mediator in sensitive negotiations between Washington and Tehran, negotiations focused on limiting Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile programs. Despite the intensity of the escalation, the diplomatic door has not fully closed. President Donald Trump issued firm statements signaling an uncompromising posture from the White House. Yet Tehran left space for de-escalation. Iran's foreign minister declared clearly, if the attacks stop, we will consider ways to reduce escalation. This reveals a tense strategic balance. Both sides are demonstrating force while carefully calculating their exit routes in a geopolitical chessboard loaded with risk. The escalation becomes even more serious, given confirmed reports that Israel eliminated some of the most powerful figures within Iran's security structure, including the defense minister and the commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. These were not symbolic targets. They represented the core of Iran's strategic command hierarchy. The strike was therefore not only military, it was structural. It forced Tehran to prove its capacity to retaliate in order to preserve deterrence credibility. Yet despite being described as unprecedented, Iran's counterstrike appears deliberately controlled. The intensity was significant, but not maximal. The operation named True Promise 4 was not merely a slogan. It functioned as a warning. Iran possesses the capacity to set the entire Middle East ablaze if cornered. The strategic message was unmistakable. If Washington and Israel continue to escalate pressure, the conflict could rapidly expand beyond bilateral confrontation into a regional war. Behind this retaliation lies a calculated gamble. By targeting U.S. bases across neighboring states, Tehran seeks to pressure Gulf governments into pressuring Washington to de-escalate. It is a risky maneuver that could alienate regional neighbors, yet Iran's options are narrowing. Its air force lacks clear superiority, its air defense network has limits. Its remaining strategic card is missile and drone deterrence weapons designed to compensate for vulnerabilities in the skies. And those missiles have now been launched. The question is no longer whether escalation has begun. The question is how far each side is prepared to go. Iran's retaliation reveals the nature of a double-edged strategy. Missiles launched from Iranian territory landed inside Gulf states. Even if the primary targets were American bases, the act itself constituted a violation of sovereignty. That reality carries enormous strategic consequences. It risks pushing Arab states toward greater unity against Tehran. Saudi Arabia condemned what it described as Iran's aggression and declared solidarity with affected nations. Qatar's foreign ministry reserved the right to respond. Although most incoming missiles were intercepted, at least one struck a U.S. base in Bahrain, home to the U.S. Fifth Fleet. In Doha, a missile interception failure led to debris crashing into a residential area, triggering an explosion and raising concerns about civilian casualties. In the United Arab Emirates, missile fragments fell across multiple zones. Hours after the initial wave, Iran continued launching additional missiles and drones toward Qatar and the UAE, signaling that the campaign was not a single gesture, but an unfolding operation. This raises a critical question. What is Tehran's true objective? One possibility is strategic signaling. After delivering its warning, Iran may now be probing enemy air defense systems, collecting data, mapping interception patterns, and preparing contingency plans for a deeper escalation scenario. A second possibility is more alarming, dragging the entire region into a widening conflict spiral that transforms bilateral confrontation into full regional war. Yet the most dangerous variable lies not in the air, but at sea, the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow maritime corridor carries roughly 20% of the world's crude oil consumption and between 20 and 30% of global liquefied natural gas exports. It is one of the most strategically vital energy arteries on the planet. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps announced that vessels would not be permitted to pass freely. Insurance companies immediately suspended coverage. Several shipping firms redirected routes. Within hours, one of the world's most critical energy corridors began to resemble a choke point under threat. If disruption continues, the consequences would extend far beyond regional politics. This would not simply be a Middle Eastern crisis. It would become a global energy shock. Oil prices would surge. Supply chains would tighten. Inflationary pressure would ripple outward across continents. And unlike previous flare-ups, this escalation is different in scale and intent. The initial U.S. and Israeli strikes did not focus solely on peripheral nuclear facilities. Instead, they struck directly at Tehran, including the Potter District, the epicenter of governmental and military authority, home to presidential compounds and senior leadership residences. Approximately 10 additional cities were targeted at military installations and strategic assets. This was not symbolic pressure. It was a direct strike into the strategic depth of the regime. And that changes the equation entirely. The escalation is no longer about isolated facilities. It is about the survivability of the system itself. Israel's response marked the largest air operation in the history of its air force. Approximately 200 fighter jets were deployed, striking more than 500 targets inside Iranian territory. The scale alone signals that this was not a limited punitive strike. It was a campaign designed to degrade Iran's retaliatory capacity at strategic depth. President Donald Trump made clear that the objective extended beyond weakening Iran's nuclear program. He called on the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the armed forces, and the police to lay down their weapons, promising full immunity. This was not diplomatic language. It was an ultimatum. The strategy appears to have shifted from traditional negotiation to what can be described as coercive diplomacy through overwhelming force. Air power is being used not only to destroy infrastructure, but to reshape political calculations inside Tehran. Israel has focused heavily on missile launch sites and production facilities, aiming to choke off the remaining deterrence capabilities that Iran relies upon. Emergency evacuation orders near the XFA industrial zone suggest that further strikes are imminent. Another wave appears to be in preparation. If Tehran refuses to concede, Washington and Jerusalem could expand the target list to include a broader segment of senior leadership, with the expectation that a sufficient shock might trigger internal upheaval. However, a clear boundary has been established. There will be no ground invasion. There will be no columns of tanks crossing into Iranian territory, no large-scale occupation, no replay of traditional land warfare campaigns. The center of gravity remains air power and precision strikes. This constraint is strategic. It means that if the regime collapses, the collapse must originate from within. Airstrikes can paralyze military infrastructure, damage command centers, and impose extraordinary pressure. But they cannot directly dismantle a deeply rooted political system that has governed for over 4 decades. Regime change, if it occurs, would require internal momentum, a societal shift capable of overwhelming the existing structure. This is not only a political equation, it is also a religious one. The power architecture of Iran is tightly fused with ideological doctrine. The leadership structure is not simply administrative, it is theological. Iran represents a unique case, a large nation with a relatively moderate society governed by a conservative clerical establishment operating through a layered security apparatus. The economy has weakened under sanctions. Isolation has deepened. Public dissatisfaction has surfaced repeatedly in waves of protest. President Trump has stated his willingness to support an internal uprising aimed at ending the current system. The primary mechanism of support would be continued air pressure if Tehran refuses Washington's demands. This is a high-stakes wager. It relies on the assumption that external military pressure can catalyze internal political fracture. But history shows that systems built for survival rarely collapse under pressure alone. They fracture only when internal cohesion breaks. And that brings us to the core question. How resilient is the Iranian system? The leadership structure in Tehran is not fragile. For more than 4 decades, it has constructed a multi-layered survival architecture designed to withstand war, sanctions, large-scale protests, and external interference. This is not merely an ideological or theocratic government. It is a tightly engineered security state in which internal stability is treated as an existential priority. Every worst-case scenario has been anticipated. Contingency layers have been prepared. And at the center of this structure stands the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The IRGC is not simply a military formation, it is a parallel power structure operating alongside the regular armed forces, answering directly to the Supreme Leader. Its mission is not primarily border defense. Its core mandate is the protection of the Islamic Revolution itself. Within this architecture, the Rala command plays a decisive role. This is not an ordinary military headquarters. It is the central internal security coordination hub for Tehran, activated whenever the regime perceives an existential threat. From this command node, intelligence agencies, police forces, Basij militias, and IRGC units are synchronized under a unified chain of command. When protests erupt, the response is not improvised. It follows a standardized operational doctrine. The first step is often nationwide internet disruption, severing communication channels and isolating communities. Once the information space is controlled, suppression operations are deployed with the structure of a domestic military campaign aimed at rapid reestablishment of control. Since 1979, the core lesson internalized by the regime has been clear: control Tehran, and you control Iran. The capital is not merely an administrative center. It houses ministries, media institutions, elite universities, economic networks, political power brokers, and the symbolic heart of state authority. In Iran's power structure, Tehran functions as the strategic heart of regime survival. When Iran's Supreme National Security Council declares a crisis state, a special mechanism activates immediately. The Rala command assumes centralized authority over Tehran province. Police, intelligence services, Basij units, and IRGC formations fall under a unified command structure, eliminating routine fragmentation. This concentration of authority serves two purposes. First, it accelerates coordinated response and ensures operational unity. Second, it reduces the number of decision makers. In times of instability, too many command layers increase the risk of leaks, hesitation, or internal disobedience. Yet while power is centralized at the apex, decentralization operates at the base. Since 2007, the IRGC has restructured its forces into provincial units under 11 major regional security headquarters. This design allows rapid, localized reaction without waiting for minute-by-minute directives from Tehran. At the top, absolute centralization. At the ground level, controlled decentralization. It is a system engineered not only to suppress unrest, but to prevent mid-level commanders from accumulating enough independent authority to challenge the regime during instability. This is not a spontaneous security network. It is a doctrine refined through crisis, and its most visible instrument on the streets is the Basij. The Basij militia is often described as a paramilitary force. In reality, it functions as a nationwide social security network woven into neighborhoods, districts, universities, and workplaces across Iran. Estimates suggest between 600,000 and 1 million members, with roughly 300,000 capable of rapid mobilization. In Tehran alone, the network includes around 300 district-level bases and nearly 3,000 neighborhood outposts. It operates like a dense internal web. Members are trained, organized, and structured for rapid activation. In the capital, their deployment scale is comparable to multiple urban security brigades. They are trained in crowd control, rapid detention, intelligence gathering, and interrogation. Their operational model emphasizes speed and psychological disruption. One of the most recognizable tactics involves small three-man motorcycle units. They move swiftly through crowds, appear suddenly, apply targeted force, then disperse before protesters can reorganize. The objective is fragmentation, intimidation, and the rapid erosion of collective momentum. This structure did not emerge by accident. It was forged in response to real crises. In 2009, following the re-election of President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the Green Movement brought millions into the streets of Tehran and other major cities. For days, the capital trembled. Many analysts at the time speculated that the regime could collapse. It did not. The Supreme Leader activated the full security apparatus. Reformist leaders were isolated. Media was tightly controlled. Suppression forces were deployed. The unrest was eventually contained. A similar pattern unfolded during later waves of protest. The security doctrine proved adaptable. The system learned, recalibrated, and strengthened. Survival through repeated crises, however, does not mean invulnerability. The most critical vulnerability does not lie solely in street protests. It lies in elite cohesion. In any regime change scenario, The decisive variable is not merely the number of people on the streets, but whether security forces maintain absolute loyalty. If fractures emerge within the IRGC, if mid-level commanders hesitate or refuse orders, if internal power struggles surface, the protective shield around the regime weakens dramatically. The system has been designed precisely to minimize that risk. The IRGC is not only an ideological military institution, it is also an economic empire. It controls between 20 and 30% of Iran's economy. It operates parallel commercial channels to bypass sanctions, maintain oil exports, and secure financial flows. Strategic sectors such as construction, energy, telecommunications, and logistics fall under its influence. Thousands of officers and their families are economically tied to this structure. Their livelihoods, status, and security depend on regime continuity. This economic entanglement acts as adhesive. Defection would not simply be political betrayal. It would mean forfeiting financial networks, personal safety guarantees, and accumulated privilege. The cost of disloyalty becomes extraordinarily high. But the regime's structural defenses extend even deeper. Iran does not rely on a single military pillar. It relies on two. Alongside the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps stands the regular army, known as the Artesh. These two forces operate under separate chains of command, with distinct institutional cultures and operational mandates. The IRGC is ideological in nature and directly tied to the Supreme Leader. The Artesh is more traditional and professional, though still under strict oversight. Their coexistence is not redundancy. It is strategic design. This dual structure creates a system of internal counterbalance. If one pillar wavers, the other remains positioned to stabilize the state. Neither force possesses unilateral capacity to reshape political outcomes without confronting the other. In many Latin American cases throughout the 20th century, national armies could determine political fate within hours. Iran's architecture makes such unilateral action significantly more difficult. Any sign of fracture in one branch would immediately trigger scrutiny and counter-pressure from the other. It is a built-in coup prevention mechanism. The Islamic Republic was born from revolution in 1979, and that memory shapes its security doctrine. The greatest fear embedded within the system is not foreign invasion. It is internal overthrow. Every structural layer reflects this anxiety. If a domestic uprising were to erupt while receiving external military pressure, Tehran's response would not be improvised. The regime would activate the entire security architecture constructed over decades. Neighborhood militias, provincial coordination nodes, centralized command in the capital, elite unity enforcement. But here lies the decisive question. Can a control system sustain indefinite pressure? History demonstrates that repressive systems can endure for long periods. Yet they can also unravel rapidly. Once a critical fracture emerges at the top, leadership succession becomes a key variable. Any instability during transition at the apex of the power pyramid could create a gap that did not previously exist. The Middle East now stands at an inflection point. Will Washington and Jerusalem intensify pressure to its maximum threshold? Or will Tehran calculate that strategic concession is preferable to existential risk? The outcome may be determined not by missiles or airstrikes, but by cohesion within the elite, within the security apparatus, and within society itself. The coming days will not merely define military positioning. They may define the survival of a system